Welcome to the CEC Report. It's March the 15th. I'm Robert Barwick. I'm joined by CEC leader Craig Isherwood. Welcome, Craig.
Yeah, thanks, Robbie.
In this week's CEC Report, Gareth Evans is planning the next world war. Treason Dossier, how the backers of Bond and Skase designed Keating's bank deregulation. And finally, defend family farmers against corporate communist plot to drive them from the land. First, Gareth Evans is planning the next world war. The most dangerous trigger for war in the world today is a doctrine enunciated by the former British Prime Minister Tony Blair called responsibility to protect. And behind that name, the agenda is actually an intention to scrap sovereignty, the principle of national sovereignty as a foundation of international law. And this agenda by Blair is a dangerous trigger for war because it's emphatically rejected by two of the powers in the world at the moment, Craig, Russia and China.
Yeah, this is Robbie. This is what we call the principle of Westphalia, or the Treaty of Westphalia principle, or the advantage of the other. It's the principle of national sovereignty that goes back, what, now, nearly 400 years now?
1648.
48. I mean, you're talking about principle overturning. Well, Tony Blair actually vigorously was part of the oligarchy to overturn this principle.
Well, and they named the principle. They named the Treaty of Westphalia. Yeah. We want to get rid of this thing, right? So this has been the cornerstone of international law for 400 years, and they're determined to destroy it. Now, the purpose of this news report, though, is because from our investigation, Craig, all of the effort now to do this is coming out of Australia. And the main person in Australia leading this is none other than Australia's Biggles, Gareth Evans.
Where did you get that name from?
Well, if you remember when he was the foreign minister under Hawkey,
yes.
And Hawkey decided to shut down the Franklin Dam, Biggles got a bit of a reputation because he used to fly down there in an Air Force jet and go over the site, and so he got the nickname Biggles.
That was after the Great World War II fighter pilot. Had no legs or something.
No, Biggles is a fictional character, Craig.
Okay, right.
The person you're talking about is a real hero. This Biggles is a fictional character. That's the nickname Evans got. So since Gareth Evans left the Australian Parliament and left Cheryl Kernot, for those who know that story, his job has been to spearhead this doctrine. Let me just go through the chronology of it because it's very interesting how it's wrapped around world events. In the year 1999, Tony Blair first announced his doctrine, and he announced it while NATO was bombing Kosovo, right? And it was the NATO bombing of Kosovo was the first time NATO, which was a defensive pact, North Atlantic Treaty Organisation, they changed the rules to allow them to do something offensive, right? And they went in and bombed Kosovo so they could free Kosovo from Serbia. That bombing was opposed by two members of the Security Council, Russia and China. Russia was very weakened in those days, couldn't do much. China opposed it as well, but they couldn't stop it. I don't know if people remember, in that bombing campaign of Belgrade, the Chinese embassy was also bombed, and the NATO guys said, that's our mistake. In this age of smart weapons, it wasn't really a mistake. China knows that. And people need to understand these things to know that there's a reason there's such deep-seated animosity about these things, right? Our side is by no means always blameless. So that was 1999. Blair announced this. The British Empire, though, works through the Commonwealth. And this is quite an important point because what you're going to see is the responsibility to protect is nothing but a Trojan horse to revive colonialism. Because what tends to happen, the way it's happened, all the incidences where there's been interventions in the name of protecting people for human rights reasons, it's usually been the old colonial master of that country that was kicked out in the 60s going back in there.
So really, Robbie, we have a responsibility to protect people against Tony Blair.
Yeah, well, that's our responsibility, that's for sure. So here's the chronology. That happened in 1999. In the year 2000, a Commonwealth country, Canada, set up what they call the International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty, and they set it up under Gareth Evans. He ran it. Funded by the Queen's personal investment manager, George Soros. And it's key that the involvement of the Queen is in there as well, because this is the colonial bit. In 2001, 2 weeks after the September 11 terrorist attack, Gareth Evans published a report he'd been working on called Responsibility to Protect. Now, the Iraq invasion, which Blair was the mastermind of, that didn't use this doctrine as the excuse. That used the claim of weapons of mass destruction being an imminent threat, and we have the right to respond to an imminent threat. However, I'm appealing to everyone's memory now. Remember, when the WMDs weren't found, because they were never there in the first place, the excuse flipped. And Blair, from that day on, and everyone else said, well, yeah, but Saddam was a monster. We did the right thing anyway. In other words, after the fact, they've started applying responsibility to protect.
Because these are war crimes. What was done by Britain and Blair was pure war crime.
And they're scrambling for a legal justification, right? And of course, that was Iraq. I mean, the biggest fiasco so far of the 21st century. So 2008, let's jump to 2008. Everyone hated the Iraq war by then. The whole thing was anyone associated with it had no credibility. George Bush was on his way out. The only reason people voted for Obama in the way they did is because they assumed he was as anti it as they were. Whereas now we see with Obama, if he was president, he would have done the same thing because he's so much in Blair's pocket too. So Blair didn't have the credibility to push this. There was a new Prime Minister in Australia, fresh-faced young fella, Kevin Rudd, who we've exposed here as a British agent for good reason, and you can look that up on our website. From Australia, Rudd organised the next boost to this doctrine. And what he did is he set up, in 2008, the Asia Pacific Centre for the Responsibility to Protect, operating out of the University of Queensland. The patron of this centre was Gareth Evans, and this centre was proudly associated with the George Soros-funded Global Centre for the Responsibility to Protect, also co-chaired by Evans.
See, of course, Robbie, you look at these coloured revolutions right throughout Europe, right, which are looking at...
Which he was running all this time.
Soros was running all these things through their various front groups, which is the same idea, responsibility to protect against these sorts of strong governments.
Well, what happened was all the coloured revolutions, and people can get out news to this and look it on the map, the ones in Europe are all on the border of Russia. And this is what Malcolm Fraser said last year in his speech warning against World War, that when the wall came down, the West reaching out to the East for development, NATO acted like the Cold War was still on. And by doing this to Russia, they were saying to Russia, we're going to conquer your neighbours and you're next. That was the message. And of course, Russia as a sovereign nation says, no, you're not. And they were especially motivated because they had 10 years of free trade by then and it had killed them. Their population had collapsed. Their economy had collapsed. So the West set this up. Where the interventions, Craig, have taken place under responsibility to protect, the actual doctrine so far has been Libya, the main one. And what Libya has done is unleashed terrorism around the world, the very thing we're supposedly fighting. The main backers, apart from the British and the Americans, etc., the old colonial powers were also in on it, France and Italy, right? Now, they want to use it in Syria. Again, it's the old colonial power of Syria, France, that wants it applied in Syria. Libya crisis has spilled over into Mali, right? And the French have now said we have the right to go in there and protect the people of Mali from something that they caused, frankly, by toppling the government of Libya. And that's bad enough. But if you want to know why this is a real trigger for World War III, the Russians and the Chinese know that the main fanatics pushing this are also open, saying that Russia and China are next. They should be targets of responsibility to protect interventions as well, right? And so these countries are saying, no, that's not going to happen. So here's the question, Craig. Why does Australia play such a key role in pushing this agenda for war?
Well, that's the question, Robbie. Why? I mean, this is insane. Why are we involved in this? Why would Australia get involved in wars historically all the time that are many thousands of miles away from it? Why would it do that?
Because it ain't for our freedom.
It's not. It's not to protect our sovereignty. It's because Australia is still shackled as a member of the British Empire. Excuse me if I use that word, but Empire and Commonwealth are synonymous. They might have stopped using gunboats and redcoats to enforce the same principles of free trade, of globalisation, of all those old policies that we're suffering from today. What they're using is now financial instruments through a global financial system, and they're using the likes of George Soros, these guys like Gareth Evans and frontmen to push the policies in order to bring back the principles of feudalism, which is why they want to undo the Treaty of Westphalia from 400 years ago, put everyone back into a state of feudalism where
it's like a corporate feudalism.
It's a corporate feudalism where you have a few people ruling over the masses, and they don't care the state of the general populations. And the way they enforce that is through war.
And it is an empire, as we highlighted here a couple of weeks ago, their own description of it from that Chatham House meeting in 1995. They call themselves an informal financial empire.
That's right.
And the political side operates through the Commonwealth.
Just have a look at Australia's history. Look at the men we sent to World War I, Gallipoli, the destruction there. Look at World War II, the fact that when we came to actually defending ourselves, all our forces were overseas and away. We've been involved in Vietnam, we've been involved in Iraq, we've been involved in Afghanistan. All these wars got nothing to do with our actual national interest, but it's pushing this idea that somehow we have to be responsible to protect peoples on the other side of the world against tyrants that necessarily are opposing the established global order, which is not true.
Yeah, well, but in the case of those countries, that is the gunboats being brought back out again.
And look, when I say tyrants, I mean Saddam Hussein, was a tyrant. However, look at the state of the country under Saddam Hussein. We know a lot of people have come from Iraq before, whilst they were under Saddam Hussein. Yeah, there was corruption, there was all sorts of horrible things that this guy did, but look at the state of the country as a whole, and it was much more stable because it was a country than it is today.
And was he more a tyrant, Craig, than, say, the royal family of Saudi Arabia?
No difference. The only difference is
they're our allies.
The only difference is that he got labelled a tyrant because the people because he was pushing this idea of sovereignty, actually, didn't like that idea.
Yep. All right, we'll have to leave it there. When we come back, we're going to have another Treason Dossier on the banking system. Welcome back to the CEC Report. Treason Dossier. How the backers of Bond and Skase designed Keating's banking deregulation. Craig, everyone is told there's a consensus. In fact, Julia Gillard calls it the post-1983 consensus on economic reform. The whole country believes that the financial reforms that Keating implemented in the 1980s transformed their economy in a great way, and we've never been better, and that's why we're so prosperous, etc., etc. We should never worry about it. However, here's my point. If you're one of the people who lost all your life savings in the 1980s on investments associated with Alan Bond or Christopher Skase, or if you're one of the people in more recent times who've either lost their life savings on Storm Financial or still have it frozen in some of these other managed investment schemes, of which there's hundreds of thousands of retired people around Australia who've got their investments frozen, blame those Paul Keating reforms.
And if you've lost your manufacturing business, and if you've lost your farming business, right, or even if you've lost your house, you can blame all those on these reforms.
Yeah. Well, what we've done, people can go to our website or get from our publication. There's an article up there now on the same page as our petition on Glass-Steagall, and it's called Why Australia Urgently Needs a Glass-Steagall Banking Separation. And there's historical background in the last two-thirds of the article under the heading The Decline and Fall of the Australian Financial System. And what that shows is the system we've got now was designed by the very people who gave the first backing to Christopher Skase and Alan Bond, the biggest corporate raiders and disasters of the 1980s. Right? In other words, those guys were not an accident, they were the point. And the losses that people suffered were also the point. So let me just give you the highlights briefly. The Australian financial system was once heavily regulated, but it was profitable for the banks and it was safe. It was safe for the banks, it was safe for us, the bank customers, or our grandparents in those days. The first rot that came into the Australian system was in the 1950s in the form of finance companies. And these were companies that were allowed to make loans that were more reckless loans, riskier loans that the banks weren't allowed to make because the banks were supposed to be safe. But Menzies said, under Menzies, the banks were allowed to own the finance companies. So they weren't allowed to make them themselves, but they were allowed to own these companies that did. And straight away, you're starting to get into the rot. It was these finance companies that got, for example, Alan Bond started. His first deal was financed by finance companies, and they're financed at high interest rates. His first million was financed by these finance companies. So that was the first right.
Which means, Robbie, because they're high interest, the only way that they can actually survive is by instigating a looting process.
Yeah.
Of corporate buyouts, takeovers, hostile takeovers, and just suck the living lifeblood out of actually previously profitable institutions in order to make those profits and pay them back to the banks.
And you're talking about interest like 20%, but the corporate raider doesn't mind paying a finance company 20% interest to back him because he's expecting to make 200% on these rating deals, right? And they're carving up our economy in doing so. So that was the first right. The second right is by the 60s you had the rise of merchant banks, or what we now today called investment banks, right? One of these I want to highlight, which started in 1974 by a consortium of global international banks like Wells Fargo and others, was called City National. City National Finance, this merchant bank, investment bank, got Christopher Skase started. Here's the thing, this bank's chairman was Keith Campbell. So he financed Christopher Skase's first deal in 75. In 1979, I've talked in the past here a lot about Hill, Samuel and Macquarie Bank. That's in this article as well, but I don't have time, we'll skip over it. Here's the point. In 1979, John Hewson was a consultant to Hill Samuel, which became Macquarie Bank. He was the economics advisor to John Howard, who was the treasurer. And Hewson got Howard to set up an inquiry into the financial system called the Financial System Inquiry. And the whole point, the inquiry was just to rubber stamp what they already planned, which was to deregulate it, right? Who did John Howard pick to run that inquiry? Sir Keith Campbell. In other words, the main guy who went on to become the architect of all the nitty-gritty reforms that was implemented to deregulate our system was the man who created Christopher Skase and foisted him on the Australian economy, right? The Campbell report predictably demanded full deregulation, which Keating delivered. This unleashed Bond and Skase and company with a vengeance. And then I want to make this point. A reason why a lot of ordinary people lost their money, Craig, is because under deregulation, the banks were all of a sudden allowed to make these kinds of loans to these cowboys that previously they hadn't been allowed to make. And so when the banks are making these loans, the ordinary investors think, well, if ANZ's investing, well, it must be safe, so I'll invest. And you had so many people lost everything. Isn't this a case of the fox not just in charge of the hen house, but designing it?
Robbie, this is straightforward corruption. This is putting in place a system designed to loot the people. It's a known risk factors here, and the risk factors are known. They don't care, right? This is why we have to bring back the Glass-Steagall. This is why we have to have a complete separation from the actual real banking system. And your point earlier, look, in the 1930s, we didn't lose any banks like they did in the United States because the Commonwealth Bank was like a Trojan protecting all the banking system, right? We didn't need a Glass-Steagall.
The rules were very strong,
right? That's what we've got to go back to. You've got to control the finances of a nation. It's got to be done in a sovereign way by the people through their government. If you don't have that, and you abrogate that responsibility to private banks, you get the sort of mess that we're in now.
Yeah.
That's why we've got to go back to Glass-Steagall.
All right. Look up that article I mentioned on our website and have a read of it. All right, when we come back, we're going to talk about the plot to drive family farmers off the land. Welcome back to the CEC Report. Finally, defend family farmers against the corporate communist plot to drive them from the land. We've always said here, Craig, that the damage that's been done by all the reforms that have been imposed on Australia has been deliberate. The damage has been the point. If you want a proof of how deliberate that is, look at the 11th of March Australian Financial Review with a column by the editor, Alan Mitchell. And this is what he says. I'll just read out the relevant sentence. It's about farming. Quote, "It is in Australia's interests for small farms to be replaced by larger corporate producers. If agriculture is the next big thing, Australia cannot afford to protect undersized, undercapitalised, overgrazed family farms from the economic pressures of the global food market. If anything, the federal government should increase the pressure on unprofitable farmers to get off the land, and it should demand that the states do the same." End quote. So here's Australia's most free trade paper demanding drive the family farmers off the land. It's like the 1800s in Ireland all over again, right? Drive them out, replace them with foreign landholders. Alan Mitchell, Craig, is a radical free marketer. He would claim to be violently anti-communist, right? But what he's demanding is corporate communism with farming collectives staffed by workers who have no stake in the operation. The only difference between that and what they had in communist countries is that it's owned by private investors instead of by the state, right? But the actual management is the same. And if you want to contrast it, one of the economic reforms that China did in recent times to unleash the miracle there is it disbanded all those collectives and gave the farms to family farmers, right? Because they're the ones who have a stake in the business, they'll look after it and then become much more profitable and much more productive. So this is your background, Craig. What's the real intention here and what should we do about it?
Look, Robbie, the guy's a liar. Let's not mince words. I've had discussions with members of Parliament from Victoria here, and they say the same thing. Oh no, deregulation is good for my dairy farm. I said, well, heck, the guy down the road has just sold up because he can't make a quid. You know, oh, that's his problem. You know, what's going to happen to him? Oh, he gets bought up, right? They get bigger, get bigger, get bigger. What's the true story? Have a look at some of these graphs that we produce, right? Yeah. Look at what's happened under deregulation under the free trade model. What you've had here is, you know, for example, rural debt for Australian farmers going from, you know, a small pittance below, what, $1 billion up to $64 billion from 1965 through to 2010. Massive. Look at the shape of the curve.
And Craig, you see this in food imports as well.
Yeah, Robbie, you see the exact same shape of the graph in food imports. Look, in 1967 we used to import a mere 118 million. Today it's over 8.9 billion. I mean, you've seen the shutdown of food producers everywhere, and they're processing factories as well. Right, so this is a result of the deregulation. And then you have a look at the area of family farms, Australian family farms, or all family farms actually, and you see it's collapsed from, you know, about 495 million hectares down to somewhere in the vicinity of just over 400 million. So you've had a lot of land taken out of actual food production. And then, but really the horrendous story is that there's some sort of a myth that we have a lot of family farms, viable family farms. Well, we did some work on that, I did some work on that, and I'd estimate we have about 40,000 actually viable family farms. So when this guy, Alan Mitchell, starts saying we should get rid of the rest of these family farms that are unviable, we're talking about having next to no actual family farmers, which used to be the backbone of our agricultural industry back in 1953, where we had 204,000 of them, disappear.
Well, and in a sense, Craig, given how this graph shows that it's what he's called for is already happening, the way he's openly calling for it shows you that what's already happened has also been as deliberate.
Robbie, I find it a real irony that in the same paper on the same day, there's another article talking about a Victorian family farm where it actually says that 1 in 4 farmers are over the age of 65. 25% of farmers are over the age of 65, whereas in any other industry around Australia it's 3%. Look, this is a holocaust in the agricultural sector. It's deliberate because, as we've said many times on this show, the intention is global depopulation. The intention of the global financial oligarchy is to put policies in place via free trade and globalisation and their complicit banking system to depopulate the world, to depopulate Australia. We've had people like Tim Flannery say that Australia can only actually support 6 to 7 million people. And the intention is to push
trying to prove it by destroying our food.
Genocidal policies. So, I mean, we've written a lot about this in the past. We've put it in our New Citizens, and people can get more information on it, Robbie, off our website.
But that's why we need to fight it. So this is what at stake. This is what's at stake in the campaigns we run. All right, we have to leave it at that. Thanks for tuning in to this week's CEC Report. Tune in for more.